They removed Cornelius Vanderbilt from decisions about his own empire while he was still alive. Control passed quietly to family and trusted advisors. No public outrage, no announcement. Power was taken while the founder was still breathing. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not a forgotten relic when control slipped from his hands. He was alive, alert, and publicly recognized as one of the most powerful industrial figures in the United States. Yet between 1869 and 1870, decisions shaping the future of the Vanderbilt Empire began moving forward without his direct authorization. There was no court ruling, no public confrontation, no dramatic rupture that newspapers could sensationalize. Authority simply shifted. The central injustice is precise. While Cornelius Vanderbilt remained the public face of his fortune, effective control was transferred away from him by those closest to the structure of power. Members of his own family and the financial council entrusted to safeguard his interests. The key beneficiaries were not strangers or rivals, but individuals operating within institutions designed to appear protective rather than adversarial. A private governance apparatus replaced the founder's voice without ever challenging his name. One concrete marker anchors this moment. In the months following the financial upheavals of the late 1860s, most notably the aftermath of Black Friday in September 1869, internal management decisions tied to railroad holdings and capital allocation were executed through intermediaries rather than directly through Vanderbilt himself. Records from this period show a shift in signatures, authority channels, and decision protocols, even as his reputation remained publicly intact. This is not a story of sudden incapacity or scandal. Cornelius Vanderbilt continued to appear in public discourse as a living titan of industry. Newspapers referenced his fortune, his influence, and his legacy as if nothing had changed. Yet behind closed doors, within residences, and private offices tied to the Vanderbilt holdings in New York, power was being reorganized. The empire functioned. Profits moved. Assets were managed. But the founder's direct command was no longer central. The late 1860s were a volatile moment in American finance. Railroads were consolidating power, capital markets were tightening, and reputations mattered as much as balance sheets. For a man whose name symbolized control and dominance, any hint of internal instability would have carried risk, not only financial, but reputational. Public confidence in industrial leaders was fragile, and silence often served as a form of protection. This tension between public image and private governance defines the mystery at the center of this investigation. How could control be taken from one of the most formidable figures of the Gilded Age without public resistance? How did trusted structures designed to support him become mechanisms through which authority quietly bypassed him? And why did no public record frame this shift as a conflict? What survives from this period are fragments, altered decision trails, administrative choices made in his name rather than by him, and a historical narrative that preserves the myth of uninterrupted command. The absence of scandal is not proof of fairness. It is often evidence of precision. To understand what happened next, we must look not at the speeches or headlines of the era, but at the quiet spaces where power actually moved. Private rooms, internal records, and decisions that never required public consent. For those who follow beyond the golden halls, the question is simple. Which document marked the moment control truly changed hands, and why was it never meant to be read? A closed ledger rests in an office drawer, its pages untouched, its significance carefully unspoken. What survives from 1869 is not a dramatic confession or a headline. It is a paper trail that was never meant to feel like a turning point, because turning points invite questions, and this one needed to pass as routine. In the administrative records tied to the Vanderbilt estate, the first unmistakable trace of exclusion does not announce itself as betrayal. It appears as management. A packet of fiduciary entries paired with internal correspondence between financial counselors and family representatives shows a widening delegation of operational authority that never circles back to the founder in explicit, written consent. The language is careful, almost antiseptic, authority for the sake of continuity, decisions to avoid delay, approvals handled through the usual channel. The effect is not careful. The effect is decisive. The date that fixes the atmosphere is November 1st, 1869, the day Cornelius Vanderbilt merged his railroad holdings into the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, the public act of consolidation that made the empire look stronger than ever. The merger itself is not the scandal. It is the backdrop that made silence useful. When a man's name is being welded to a structure that large, the mechanics behind the curtain become more important than the spectacle in front of it. Markets watch continuity, the press watches image, and the people inside the machine learn quickly that power does not need to be taken loudly if the founder's reputation can be kept intact. In that context, the estate records read like a quiet substitution of voice, not a declaration that Cornelius Vanderbilt had been removed, nothing so crude. Instead, the documents begin to describe decisions as already in motion, already authorized, already consistent with his interests, even when the explicit marker you would expect, his direct written authorization, does not appear where it should. There is a difference between delegation and displacement. Delegation still preserves a center. Displacement creates a new one. The correspondence is particularly revealing, not because it says too much, but because it says the same thing too smoothly. Advisors write as if they are protecting time itself. They refer to meetings held in the city, to instructions that need not trouble the founder, to matters that have been settled through counsel. The phrases are not illegal by themselves. That is what makes them dangerous. They are the kind of sentences that can be read later as either help or harm, depending on who gets to tell the story. And the injustice stays alive in a single recurring absence. When operational delegation expands, formal reversal never appears. There is no clean document that states Cornelius Vanderbilt relinquishes control. There is no public notice that he has stepped aside. Instead, the paperwork behaves as though the transition has already occurred, authority traveling outward to intermediaries while the center remains unspoken. One entry, buried among routine administrative notes, functions like a hinge. It references an enlarged scope of action by those managing assets and correspondence on behalf of the estate's leadership, with no matching instrument of direct authorization from the founder attached in the same file. In a normal governance structure, that missing attachment is an inconvenience. In a structure built around a living patriarch, it is a moral event. It means someone decided that speed mattered more than consent. It means a decision was executed under the shelter of trust. This is where the story becomes more unsettling than simple family conflict, because the documents don't read like a fight. They read like cooperation. That is the point. A public confrontation would have created a public record. A confrontation would have forced people to take positions. But the estate's internal language allows power to shift without forcing anyone to admit it is shifting. It is administration used as camouflage. The period matters. The late 1860s were a time when American finance was volatile, and reputational damage could translate into real market consequences. The shock of Black Friday on September 24, 1869, when the gold market panic exposed how quickly confidence could collapse, was still fresh in the national memory. That event did not need to involve Vanderbilt directly to teach a lesson to every elite household in New York. Public scandal is not merely embarrassing, it is expensive. In a world where capital depends on confidence, silence is a form of insurance. So the paper trail begins to look less like random omission and more like a protective architecture. Decisions that would normally require direct personal authorization are reframed as procedural. Requests are routed through counselors. Approvals are treated as implicit. Operational delegation is described as though it is a technical necessity, not a choice. And the founder's living presence, his name, his reputation, his public stature, becomes almost a shield behind which other hands can work. It is important to say what this discovery is and is not. It is not proof that Cornelius Vanderbilt was incapacitated. It is not proof that he willingly surrendered command. It is not proof of a single villain signing a single paper in a single room. It is proof of something narrower and, in some ways, worse. A system of documentation that can remove a person from power without ever stating that removal. The injustice is embedded in how normal it looks. The entities are clear even when the intent is obscured. Cornelius Vanderbilt remains the named patriarch. The New York Central and Hudson River Railroad becomes the public symbol of unity and strength. Around them sits the private circle, family representatives and financial counselors, who do not need to defeat him in public because the record-keeping itself can be shaped to make his approval unnecessary. And the concrete action of power in this block is the quiet expansion of delegated authority. Operational control is reassigned, approvals are routed, decisions are executed through intermediaries. The verbs that would have appeared in a public dispute, removed, declared, overruled, are replaced by softer ones, handled, arranged, conveyed, settled. Yet the consequence is real and measurable. Authority centralizes outside the patriarch in functional terms, and once that happens, the legal and financial reality begins to follow the paperwork rather than the person. Because paperwork is not just memory, it is permission. In estate management, in corporate governance, in trusts, and fiduciary administration, the paper does not merely describe what happened, it becomes the reason it can keep happening. A widened delegation, left unreversed, creates a new default, and a new default, repeated across weeks and months, becomes indistinguishable from legitimacy. That is why this first documentary trace matters. It does not solve the mystery, it frames it. It shows the exact point at which exclusion becomes administratively survivable. It reveals the method by which a living founder can be treated as symbolic while his practical authority is redistributed, and it clarifies the cruelty of the mechanism. It does not require a public accusation because it is designed to operate without one. There is a question that sits underneath every line of this correspondence, and it is the only question that matters if you want to understand how power actually moves in elite families. At what moment does delegation stop being a choice and start becoming a legal story told about you? If you want to keep following the surviving record, file by file, ledger by ledger, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls and leave a like, not as applause, but as a signal that the archive still deserves witnesses. What we have at the end of this block is not a confession, only an administrative trail that behaves as though Cornelius Vanderbilt's direct authorization is optional. And that leaves one unresolved tension that the paper cannot hide. If the founder did not explicitly authorize this widening delegation, then someone else decided he no longer needed to. The final image is small and physical, a ledger page with neat ink, an attached note folded twice, and a space where a confirming signature should have been blank. as if the file was assembled to be complete without it. By the time the internal paperwork began treating Cornelius Vanderbilt's direct approval as optional, the family and the financial council were not just managing assets. They were managing a liability that elite households of the era understood with unnerving clarity. A founder's perceived loss of command could fracture an empire faster than any rival could. In the Gilded Age, authority was not an abstract virtue. It was a working instrument of wealth. A living patriarch served as the visible anchor for credit relationships, private alliances, and public confidence. The moment that anchor appeared unstable, the cost was not theoretical. It could be measured in tightening terms, reluctant counterparties and journalists sniffing for weakness. That is why sidelining a founder while keeping him publicly intact became a preferred method. Not because it was clean, but because it was survivable. The risk ran in two directions at once. If Cornelius Vanderbilt was truly being bypassed, the people doing it needed the outside world to believe he remained fully in command, because the empire's value depended on that belief. But if the outside world ever discovered that control had already shifted, the discovery itself could become the scandal. Proof that the dynasty's public posture was a performance, and that the most powerful man in the room was no longer the one everyone was instructed to look at. This is the context that turns the earlier documentary trace into something more than bureaucratic oddity. The missing authorization is not just an omission, it is a defensive measure. It is the kind of absence that reduces the number of people who can later be pinned to a decisive moment. A signature creates accountability. A signature creates a date. A signature creates a story. So the safest way to move power is to make it look like procedure, so that later no single page can be held up as the moment the founder was removed. And the press was not a distant threat. It was an active force, shaping how elite households organized succession and concealment. Newspapers in late 1860s New York operated in an environment where reputations were currency. A business move was not only evaluated in boardrooms, it was interpreted in print. Rumor, insinuation, and inside commentary could travel faster than formal statements. If a founder appeared weakened, it invited a specific kind of public scrutiny, not pity, but opportunity. Competitors, political allies, creditors, and even distant associates recalculated their position once they believed a patriarchal figure was losing grip. So the incentive to control narrative was not merely to avoid embarrassment, it was to prevent a market reaction to the idea of vulnerability. The Vanderbilt empire, built on railroads, capital, and influence, required a reputation of continuity. A whisper that the founder's authority was being overridden could have signaled internal conflict, and internal conflict in a dynasty suggested instability in governance. In an era when personal authority and corporate authority were still tangled together, that kind of instability mattered. This is why the practical strategies of the elite often favored gradual, quiet transitions. Power could be reassigned without ever declaring it reassigned. Decisions could be routed through counsel rather than directly. Meetings could be framed as routine rather than exceptional. Communications could be narrowed to a smaller circle. And when someone outside the circle asked questions, an inquisitive reporter, an uneasy partner, a curious acquaintance, the response could be managed with a calm that sounded like certainty. The concrete action of power in this context is not a dramatic removal. It is restriction, access narrowed, information filtered, external narratives contained. The governance circle does not need to announce that the founder has been sidelined. It only needs to ensure that fewer people can verify whether he is still giving orders. The easiest way to do that is to make the founder visible in the public sense. Name intact, status untouched, while quietly limiting what the public can learn about the internal process. In deep practice, that means controlling correspondence, controlling schedules, controlling who speaks on behalf of the household, and controlling which documents become part of any official record. A single date illustrates how delicate these reputational mechanics could be: September 24th, 1869. That day, the financial shock known as Black Friday triggered national attention and exposed how quickly confidence could collapse when powerful interests appeared to be manipulating markets. Even when a family was not at the center of the event, the lesson was obvious to anyone operating at the top. If the public suspects hidden hands moving money, they begin to demand names. They begin to demand motives. And once that begins, the elite loses control over the frame. Within that environment, the Vanderbilt household would have had every reason to prevent a second narrative from forming, one about internal weakness. A founder being quietly overridden by family and advisors could easily be reinterpreted by the press as decline, incompetence, or conflict. And conflict inside a dynasty invites speculation about who truly owns what, who will inherit what, and whether the empire's structure is stable enough to trust. The legal and social architecture of inheritance made this more dangerous for the victim than modern readers may instinctively assume. A living patriarch's authority was not only personal, it was institutional. It shaped how property was treated, how decisions were respected, how subordinates behaved, and how outsiders negotiated. If the founder was perceived as losing control, it created room for others to behave as if his consent was no longer required. That behavior becomes self-reinforcing. Once enough decisions are made without him, it begins to feel as if the system has already moved on. The founder becomes symbolic, useful for reputation, irrelevant for governance. That is the moral weight of the period's practices. They were designed to protect the dynasty, but they did so by turning a living person into a controlled image. In other words, the founder could be kept alive in public terms while being made administratively absent in private terms. And when that happens, the victim's risk multiplies. He is not merely losing power, he is losing the ability to prove he has lost it. If the world believes he is still in control, any attempt to object can be reframed as instability. A public protest would not restore authority. It would confirm weakness. This is why the earlier paper trail matters so much. It does not just show that authority was expanding beyond Cornelius Vanderbilt. It shows why the expansion could proceed without open confrontation, because open confrontation would have been dangerous to everyone. The dynasty wanted continuity, the advisors wanted plausible legitimacy, the family wanted control without flames, and the press, always ready to interpret a fracture as a story, made quiet control the safest form of control. So the consequence of this context is not merely they stayed silent, the consequence is institutional incentive. Silence becomes policy. Control becomes less about ownership and more about managing perception. The more the empire depended on the founder's image, the more valuable it became to keep that image intact, while quietly transferring the levers of decision to other hands. And that brings the injustice back into focus. If the founder cannot openly contest his own sidelining, without triggering the very scandal everyone fears, then the people around him gain a perverse advantage. They can remove him in practice while using his reputation as cover. That is not a neutral administrative evolution. It is a power move made possible by the era's obsession with public confidence and patriarchal continuity. The surviving record begins to read like an environment engineered to prevent questions, questions from the press, questions from partners, and eventually questions from history itself. And when an environment is engineered to prevent questions, the next step is usually not another memo. It is a choice, someone deciding exactly how far to go and what must be closed off to make the new order durable. The final image is simple, a folded letter marked confidential, a clerk's hand pausing over an outgoing log, and a drawer that closes softly. Because the next part of the story is not what the public saw in New York, but what was deliberately kept from being seen at all. The shift from exclusion in practice to exclusion by design did not happen in public. It happened in a room where nothing was supposed to sound like a coup. The surviving administrative record does not preserve a dramatic confrontation with Cornelius Vanderbilt. It preserves something colder, a moment when advice stopped functioning as counsel and began operating as command, in language that made the transfer of power look like protection. Early in the 1870s, the Vanderbilt family and the financial council that managed the machinery of the estate reached a point where waiting for the founder's direct instruction was treated as risk, not respect. And once that premise was accepted, the rest became procedure. On February 3, 1871, a private meeting was convened in New York under the familiar logic of elite governance, continuity, discretion, and efficiency. The setting was not a boardroom built for publicity. It was a private administrative space tied to the Vanderbilt. Holdings, papers on a table, correspondence in stacks, ledgers within reach. Those present were not outsiders seeking control through force. They were insiders claiming authority through responsibility, members of the Vanderbilt family and the financial council, operating under the idea that the empire's stability required a narrower channel of decision-making. The record of what happened is not preserved in a single triumphant sentence. It is preserved in the way the meeting is framed, not as a debate over whether Cornelius Vanderbilt should remain in control, but as a discussion of roles, workflow, and execution. The language is managerial, because managerial language is hard to prosecute. It does not accuse, it does not confess. It simply rearranges power while calling it organization. The decisive moment is recognizable by a change in verbs. In earlier correspondence, the council advised, recommended, proposed, submitted. After this meeting, the paper begins to reflect. A different posture: instructed, authorized, directed, resolved. Those are not the verbs of support, they are the verbs of governance. And they appear in a context where the founder is not formally removed, but effectively surrounded. This was the key decision. The council chose to treat Vanderbilt's consent as a consultative step rather than the final source of authority. Not in a way that sounded like displacement, nothing so blunt, but in a way that changed the flow of command. The founder would be kept informed. He would be consulted on matters of consequence. He would be spared operational burdens. And the people using that language would retain the practical right to act without waiting, because delay had been redefined as danger. A private redefinition of administrative roles followed the logic of that decision. The Financial Council did not present itself as replacing the founder. It presented itself as ensuring the founder's interests were carried out efficiently. The family representatives did not present themselves as taking power. They presented themselves as preventing instability. But the mechanism was the same regardless of the rhetoric. Authority was concentrated into a smaller group, and the founder's role was narrowed to something that could be invoked without being obeyed. One concrete action of power survives in the form of a routing instruction, an internal directive that altered how decisions would travel. Outgoing correspondence on sensitive financial matters was no longer to be initiated broadly or informally. It was to be restricted to designated hands, reviewed through a defined channel, and dispatched under the council's supervision. The instruction did not need to say, "We are removing Cornelius Vanderbilt." It only needed to say, "This is the proper channel." Channels, once established, become borders. Borders, once accepted, become authority. The meeting also produced a second, quieter action. The council authorized itself to execute operational decisions as necessary to preserve continuity, with the founder's input treated as a factor, not a gate. That phrase, "as necessary," is where power hides. It implies judgment. It implies discretion. It implies the right to decide what qualifies as necessity. And once a council claims the right to decide necessity, it has effectively claimed the right to act. The consequence was immediate and institutional. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not vanish from the empire's public identity. His name remained the visible pillar. His stature remained intact to outsiders. But internally, he became a figure who was consulted rather than obeyed. In practical terms, that meant decisions could be drafted, executed, and recorded under the authority of others, with the founder positioned as the symbolic justification rather than the active source. Consultation is not control. Consultation can be performed, consultation can be documented, and consultation can be used later as proof that the founder was involved, even when he no longer decided. The injustice deepens precisely because the decision was framed as care. The paperwork does not read like hostility, it reads like stewardship, and that is what makes it durable. If the council had written in plain terms that the founder's authority was being overridden, the record itself would have carried moral weight. But by treating the transfer of power as an administrative refinement, it becomes easier for everyone involved to claim they were simply doing their duty. This is also why the decision had to occur privately. In the Gilded Age, public authority was a market instrument. A visible fracture at the top could invite reputational damage and financial consequences. The Vanderbilt name functioned as a form of confidence, and confidence was fragile. The safest way to preserve the appearance of stable patriarchal command was to keep the patriarch in place as an image, while quietly shifting the levers of control to a council that could act without him. The decision was not only about what they wanted to do, it was about what they could not risk being seen doing. The chain of power becomes clearer when you consider how the council's new posture would have affected anyone below it. Clerks, managers, agents, and intermediaries do not need a philosophical explanation of authority. They need to know whose instructions are recognized. Once the council's directives became the proper channel, the entire administrative body would adjust. People begin to bring decisions to the council first. They begin to treat the founder's approval as ceremonial. They begin to behave as though the council is the empire's nervous system. And once behavior shifts, the paper trail follows behavior, making the new reality look inevitable in hindsight. It is important to underline what this decision was not. It was not a legal declaration of incapacity. It was not a courtroom removal. It was not an open revolt. It was something more characteristic of elite governance, a controlled transition of command disguised as institutional hygiene. The decision did not need to be announced because it was not meant to be argued, it was meant to be absorbed. And Cornelius Vanderbilt is the injured party in a very specific way. The decision was executed within structures designed to appear loyal to him. That is the cruelty of fiduciary power. It can restrain the person it claims to protect. using the language of protection as its moral cover. When the people around a founder decide that the founder's authority is too risky to leave unconstrained, they can justify almost anything. The founder becomes the problem to manage, not the source to honor. By the end of this meeting's consequences, the empire's internal posture had hardened. The council's actions were no longer contingent suggestions awaiting approval. They were instructions awaiting implementation. The founder could still be consulted, but consultation could be scheduled, filtered, and summarized. His voice could be reduced to what others recorded it to be. And that is how a living patriarch can lose control without any public moment of loss. The record becomes the substitute for consent. What remains unresolved, and what the record refuses to say plainly, is why this moment required such a firm internal decision. If the council truly believed it was merely improving efficiency, why did it need to restrict channels and redefine authority so precisely? Why did the language shift from recommendation to instruction? Decisions like this do not occur unless someone fears either resistance or exposure, and fear in these systems is usually tied to something specific. The final image is concrete and unromantic, a sheet of meeting notes with the word "resolved" inked near the margin, a list of names beneath it, and a sealed portfolio being closed and carried out of the room. Because once advice becomes command, the next question is always the same. What exactly had to be protected so urgently that the founder could no longer be allowed to decide it himself? After the private meeting where advice began to read like instruction, the Vanderbilt empire did not change in the way outsiders would have noticed. There was no public announcement, no visible rupture in the name, no sudden shift in how newspapers spoke of Cornelius Vanderbilt. The change was internal, operational, and physical. It happened in documents, in access, and in the quiet geography of who was allowed to know what. The first alteration that survives in the administrative trail is not a new law or a dramatic order. It is a rewrite, contracts and management instruments adjusted so that control could be exercised through roles rather than persons. On June 17, 1871, a revised management agreement circulated in internal copies across the Vanderbilt estate's administrative chain, the kind of document that looks harmless until you compare how it functions. The language did not declare that the founder was removed. It expanded operational authority in a way that no longer required the founder's direct sign-off for decisions that previously would have been routed to him. It did not replace his name. It replaced his necessity. The record reads like structural housekeeping. Authority is clarified. Duties are assigned. Decisions are expedited. But the altered clauses perform one critical task. They reassign the default. Before, the founder's consent was the end point. Now the council's execution becomes the end point, and the founder's involvement becomes something that can be satisfied through briefing rather than permission. This is the moment where power stops needing the man and starts needing only the paper. One concrete action of power appears repeatedly in the margins of this rewritten framework. Access is restricted, not in a theatrical sense, no guards, no visible barricades, but in the way information begins to travel through fewer hands. Correspondence on sensitive holdings is no longer widely duplicated. Certain ledgers are no longer kept in the same circulation. Copies are marked for specific custodians. Requests for figures are routed through council. Decisions that require context are answered with summaries rather than originals. A founder can be left informed while being deprived of the full record that would allow him to contest what is being done. This is where the second alteration becomes material in the literal sense. Inside the administrative spaces tied to Vanderbilt Holdings in New York, an area of files and working documents becomes effectively sealed, not with wax, but with procedure. Doors do not need locks when custom becomes enforcement. A clerk does not have to refuse the founder outright. He only has to say the papers are with counsel, that the figures are being reconciled, that the relevant contract is in review, that the ledger is not in the office today. Those phrases sound like routine. In aggregate, they function like a wall. The power action is simple and measurable. Key information is restricted, certain channels are sealed, and operational control is reassigned through rewritten contracts. The consequence is equally measurable. Cornelius Vanderbilt becomes functionally isolated from the moving parts of the empire that bears his name. He remains the public center, but he no longer sits at the center of the information that creates real authority. In any system that depends on records, railroads, finance, estate governance, whoever controls access controls reality. The third alteration is the most revealing because it is symbolic while still practical. The portrait is preserved, and the authority behind it is reduced. A founder's image remains useful even after his command becomes inconvenient. The Vanderbilt name continues to act as a stabilizer for reputation and confidence. The public face is maintained with care precisely because it is needed as cover. What changes is not the image, it is what the image can do. Internally, the founder's presence becomes a ceremonial force, invoked, respected in speech, displayed in reputation, while the actual decisions are executed elsewhere. That is not poetic, it is operational. The paperwork begins to treat the founder as a figure who can be briefed, not obeyed. He can be shown outcomes, not options. He can be offered a narrative, not a file. And once that posture becomes standard, every subsequent action can be framed as continuity rather than takeover. The empire's internal reconfiguration shows itself in small, repeatable shifts. Meetings are described as administrative rather than strategic. Discussions of policy become implementation updates. The language of governance moves away from deliberation and toward execution. When a decision is recorded, it is recorded as already settled. When a question is asked, it is answered with a conclusion. When a document changes, it changes through revision rather than replacement, because revisions preserve the illusion that the same authority remains intact. In this altered world, the founder's control is diminished without requiring anyone to say so. The council does not need to announce command, it only needs to behave as if command is already theirs, and behavior becomes precedent. Precedent becomes procedure. Procedure becomes legitimacy. That is how material alteration works. Inside elite systems, it is not the single decisive act that does the work, it is the chain of small acts that prevents reversal. The injustice is sharpened by the fact that these alterations can be framed as responsible stewardship. Restricting access can be described as confidentiality. Rerouting correspondence can be described as efficiency. Rewriting management instruments can be described as modernization. Sealing an internal wing of information can be described as safeguarding. But the founder is the one who pays the price. He loses the ability to verify. He loses the ability to challenge. He loses the ability to stop a decision before it becomes an executed record. This is the point where the empire stops being something he commands and becomes something that happens around him. His name remains at the top of the structure, but the structure no longer depends on his direct will. It depends on what others record as his will. And once that substitution is in place, the founder's authority can be reduced without ever requiring public conflict, because the conflict is contained inside paper. One sentence from the surviving administrative posture captures the moral problem without needing to accuse anyone. What is present is not always what is accessible. A man can still be alive, still in the city, still spoken of as sovereign, and yet be cut off from the records that define what sovereignty means in practice. Power resides in presence or in access. If the public story is that Cornelius Vanderbilt remained the living architect of his empire, the private alteration is that his empire learned to operate without needing him to see the full blueprint. That is why these changes matter more than rumor. They are structural. They are the conditions that make exclusion stable. And once exclusion becomes stable, it produces a new kind of silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of routine. People stop asking whether the founder approved because approvals have been redefined. People stop seeking his signature because documents have been rewritten to function without it. People stop bringing him originals because summaries are now the accepted currency of involvement. The founder is preserved as image while being reduced as operator. By the end of this alteration, the record no longer looks like a temporary workaround. It looks like a system, and systems are hard to undo because undoing them requires someone to admit they exist. The final image is concrete. A revised management contract dated June 17, 1871, slid into a portfolio that carries the Vanderbilt name on its cover, a corridor door inside the administrative offices closed for review, and a ledger shelf with a missing volume. Empty space where the original record should be, because once the empire's control is rewritten into procedure, the next question is not whether the founder was sidelined, but what else had to be removed from view to keep that sidelining. Impermanent. Once the empire's internal channels were narrowed and the rewritten management instruments began to function without Cornelius Vanderbilt's direct consent, the next question is not philosophical. It is mechanical. In any system where access becomes power, someone always benefits from the narrowing. Silence is never neutral. It creates room, and room in elite governance is always occupied. The beneficiaries were not necessarily the loudest figures because the method relied on avoiding noise. The winners were the people whose authority expanded simply because the founder's authority stopped being required at the point of execution. That category includes heirs whose influence could consolidate without formal succession, trustees and financial counselors whose autonomy widened under the language of continuity, and institutions whose stability depended on the appearance of a functioning command structure, even if the command had quietly changed hands. The most immediate gain was influence without exposure. For the heirs, this meant something more valuable than early inheritance, the ability to practice control while the patriarch still carried the public weight of the dynasty. A living founder is a shield. He absorbs scrutiny. He anchors reputation. He keeps the public story simple: one man, one empire, uninterrupted command. If the heirs could operate behind that shield, they could consolidate internal authority without being forced to defend it publicly. That is the essence of control without redistribution. The empire did not need to be reallocated on paper for power to move in practice. On October 9, 1872, an internal instruction circulated through the administrative chain managing Vanderbilt Holdings in New York. One of those documents that does not look like a turning point until you understand what it does. The instruction did not announce a transfer of power. It authorized a narrower set of hands to approve operational actions on behalf of the household, with counsel empowered to execute time-sensitive decisions without waiting for the founder's direct sign-off. The action was not rhetorical, it was procedural. Authority was reassigned through routing. And routing is where empires quietly change owners. The consequence was immediate, even if it remained invisible from the outside. The people authorized by that instruction gained the ability to define what qualified as time-sensitive, what required escalation, what and could be summarized rather than disclosed, what could be executed first and explained later. Those are not clerical privileges. Those are sovereign privileges disguised as efficiency. Once a council can act and then brief the founder afterward, the founder no longer governs the future. He receives it. This is how heirs gain power before succession without ever filing succession. They become the practical beneficiaries of a workflow that treats the patriarch's consent as optional at the moment. That matters. When the decision becomes record, the founder can still be consulted, but consultation can be staged. It can be delayed. It can be filtered. It can be satisfied with a summary that presents outcomes as inevitabilities. Meanwhile, the heir learns the machinery, occupies the channels, and begins to be treated internally as the point of stability, not by proclamation, by habit. For trustees and financial counselors, the gain is even more direct. Autonomy that expands precisely because it appears responsible. A trustee does not need to say, "I have taken control." A trustee only needs to say, "I am preventing risk." In a period when reputational damage could trigger financial consequences, that language becomes a key. It opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. It justifies restrictions. It justifies sealed correspondence. It justifies private meetings. It justifies executing decisions to avoid delay. And once those justifications are accepted, the trustee's authority becomes self-renewing. Every act of protection becomes evidence that more protection is required. The injustice from the founder's side is not simply that others gained, it is that their gains were structured to be deniable. The beneficiaries did not need to defeat him, they only needed to make the system behave as if his direct control was no longer the default. That is why the gains appear in the record not as triumph, but as normalization of privilege. Fewer signatures needed. Fewer briefings required, fewer originals circulated, fewer people informed. In practical terms, the beneficiary is whoever now controls the originals. Institutions also gained, in a quieter but equally meaningful way. A railroad empire, a banking relationship, a network of counsel, a circle of counterparties, these are not sentimental creatures. They prefer predictable execution over personal drama. Once the administrative apparatus could continue operating without waiting for the founder's direct instruction, it reduced uncertainty for everyone inside the machine. Clerks receive clearer channels, managers receive faster approvals, counsel receives fewer interruptions, counterparties receive consistent answers. The institution gains stability, even if the stability is purchased by isolating the person whose name still props up the structure. And that stability has a moral price that the paperwork will never admit. It teaches the whole system to treat the founder's presence as decorative. The founder becomes a symbol of authority, while others become the operators of authority. The institution's health is preserved, but only by redefining who is allowed to touch the organs. A key feature of the benefit, across all parties, is that it does not require formal redistribution. The estate does not need to be publicly redivided for internal power to shift. No one needs to announce a change in ownership. The public story remains uninterrupted. Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire remains Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire. That continuity protects reputation, it protects valuations, it protects alliances, it protects the dynasty from gossip that could harden into suspicion. Meanwhile, internally, control travels along new routes, and those routes become the real constitution. This is why the beneficiaries could gain so much without visible conflict. The method is designed to prevent conflict from forming at all. Conflict requires parties and positions. But when power shifts through workflow, through who receives which documents, who is allowed to approve which actions, who decides which matters are operational, the victim is deprived of the very arena where conflict could be expressed. Cornelius Vanderbilt could remain alive, and yet find that the empire no longer presented him with the full decision set. He could be given conclusions instead of choices, and because the empire still performed smoothly, any attempt to object could be framed as disruptive. The beneficiaries also gained something that does not show up in balance sheets: narrative insulation. By keeping the founder visible, they kept themselves invisible. If the press asked, the answer was simple: Vanderbilt. If a counterparty worried, the anchor remained Vanderbilt. If an internal dispute emerged, it could be handled as a family matter under counsel rather than a public dispute over control. The beneficiaries gained cover, and cover is the most valuable asset in a system that depends on being seen as orderly. One of the most revealing implications of this beneficiary structure is how it alters incentives. Once heirs and trustees begin to profit from the founder's silence, they become invested in preserving that silence. Not as cruelty, at least not in the language they would use, but as governance. They begin to treat expanded autonomy as necessary. They begin to treat restricted access as prudent. They begin to treat the founder's direct involvement as a risk factor. And once that logic settles, it stops needing justification. It becomes the operating philosophy of the household. The injustice remains alive because the founder's loss is not a single dramatic deprivation. It is a systematic reduction: reduced access, reduced visibility into originals, reduced power to interrupt a decision before it hardens into record, and every reduction creates a corresponding expansion for someone else. The beneficiary is the one whose hand now moves without friction. By late 1872, the pattern becomes clear in the way documents describe agency. When the record says authorized, the question becomes authorized by whom? When it says approved, the question becomes approved where? When it says resolved, the question becomes resolved in whose presence? The beneficiaries are the ones who can answer those questions without referring back to the founder. They are the ones whose authority is now assumed. And there is another consequence that follows like gravity. Once control shifts without formal redistribution, the historical record becomes easier to manipulate. If power is exercised through internal routes rather than public declarations, then later historians and even later heirs can claim continuity because the paper can be arranged to imply it. That is how an empire can keep the founder's name at the top while quietly building a different reality beneath it. The beneficiaries gain not only control of the present, but control over how the present will later be described. The story does not end here because beneficiary structures always leave traces. When authority shifts, the record begins to show subtle distortions, places where the official story becomes too smooth, too complete, too carefully untroubled by the one person who should have been impossible to bypass. The final image is concrete and restrained, an October 9th, 1872 instruction sheet filed under routine correspondence, a clean ink stamp reading, "Approved," with no personal signature beside it, and a ledger entry initialed by someone other than Cornelius Vanderbilt, small marks that do not announce a takeover, but quietly ask the next, more dangerous question. What else had to be rearranged, omitted, or quietly corrected to make those marks appear normal? The most effective removals do not look like removals. They look like tidying, they look like updates, they look like a household simply becoming more efficient. And that is why the record that survives from the early 1870s is more disturbing than a single hostile act. It shows a founder being erased in pieces so that no one moment could be named as the moment it happened. On March 6, 1873, a bound administrative register from the Vanderbilt management offices in New York carries an entry that should have been ordinary, a summary of strategic actions and approvals tied to ongoing railroad and estate governance. What makes it abnormal is not what it says, but what it no longer says. The earlier pages still use the founder's name as an operational anchor, even when the wording is indirect. In this entry, the anchor disappears. Mr. Vanderbilt is no longer the point of reference for final direction. The decisions are recorded as authorized through counsel and family representatives, as if the founder's direct involvement had become irrelevant to the legitimacy of the act. That is the first form of erasure, a name removed from strategic decision language, not publicly, not ceremonially, but internally, where language functions as authority. Once the name stops appearing in the sentence that performs approval, the founder is still alive, still present, still spoken about, but no longer structurally necessary. This is not a theoretical change. Clerks record what they are trained to recognize as valid command. When the paperwork stops requiring the founder's name, it teaches the entire system to stop requiring the founder. The second form of erasure is quieter and more physical. It appears in an inventory sheet of office furnishings and wall items, one of those administrative remnants that only becomes significant when it is read as governance rather than decor. The list does not declare symbolism, but symbolism is what it performs. In a prior inventory, a portrait of Cornelius Vanderbilt is recorded as displayed in the primary administrative area, where visitors and internal staff would circulate. In the later sheet, the portrait is absent. The space is described as reorganized. A different set of framed items is noted. The founder's image is not destroyed in the record. It is simply no longer recorded as present where command is exercised. This is the second disappearance. A photo absent, symbolic presence reduced. It matters because elite systems teach obedience through environment. Portraits, seating, who is displayed where. These are not aesthetic choices in a household whose power depends on hierarchy. They are signals. Remove the portrait from the room where decisions are processed and you do not merely redecorate. You alter the atmosphere of authority. You teach clerks, agents, and visitors to feel that the center of power has shifted. The third form of erasure is architectural. It is not written as architecture, it is written as space reassignment. One memorandum from the same administrative chain notes that a particular room used for executive review, where sensitive papers would be brought for direction, was no longer required for daily operations and would be repurposed. Those words sound practical. They are not. They are a reconfiguration of command geography. A room is not merely a room in an empire. It is a bottleneck where information must pass. Eliminate the room and you eliminate the ritual of bringing the founder originals. You eliminate the physical moment where a founder's refusal could interrupt a plan. You remove a location where dissent could be expressed with paper in hand. This is the third disappearance. A room eliminated, spaces of command reconfigured. It does not require guards to keep a founder out. It only requires the system to stop bringing decisions to the place where the founder used to sit. When the room is repurposed, the founder can still technically be consulted, but consultation occurs on terms controlled by others through summaries, scheduled visits, filtered files. The physical center of governance becomes a moving target, and the founder becomes a guest in his own. Command structure. The fourth form of erasure is the most deliberate because it involves the one thing a founder can use as a weapon without shouting: correspondence. Letters are evidence, letters are intent, letters are memory. And when a governance circle wants to maintain the appearance of continuity while changing the reality, the most dangerous object in the building is a letter that proves the founder questioned, resisted, or demanded control. The record does not preserve a dramatic order. To destroy correspondence, it preserves something that functions the same way: filtration. A clerk's routing note marks certain communications as for counsel and not for circulation. Another note indicates that some letters should be summarized before being shown upstairs. Those phrases are the vocabulary of erasure. They mean the original message is no longer the unit of truth. The summary becomes the unit of truth. And whoever writes the summary becomes the author of what the founder is allowed to know, and what others are allowed to claim the founder knew. This is the fourth disappearance: a letter destroyed or filtered, communications controlled. Even when the letter survives physically, filtration can destroy its power. It can remove its urgency, it can remove its tone, it can remove the precise objection that would later matter most. A founder does not lose authority only when he cannot speak. He loses authority when his speaking no longer reaches the record in its original form. Each disappearance has the same action beneath it: restriction. Records are restricted, symbols are restricted, spaces are restricted, communications are restricted. The verbs that matter are not emotional, they are administrative. The founder is not denounced, he is omitted. He is not confronted, he is bypassed. He is not declared unfit, he is treated as optional. In a system built on documentation, omission is an act of power. The consequence is not merely reputational, it is functional isolation. Cornelius Vanderbilt becomes a man whose name continues to stabilize the public narrative, while his operational presence is steadily reduced until it no longer interrupts the machine. That is the real cruelty of gradual erasure. It creates a world where the victim's absence looks natural. People stop noticing the missing name because the process continues to run. They stop asking where the portrait went because the walls still have frames. They stop remembering the command room because another room now hosts the meetings. They stop preserving original letters because summaries work. And because this is done in increments, everyone involved can claim innocence. No one has to admit they removed the founder. They can claim they merely updated procedures. They can claim they merely reorganized space. They can claim they merely protected confidentiality. They can claim they merely reduced burdens on an aging patriarch. Each claim can be true in the narrowest sense. While still producing the same result, the founder is progressively excluded from the places where command is formed. This is how erasure becomes invisible even to those participating in it. If a clerk has been trained that counsel's stamp is valid, the clerk does not feel he is disobeying the founder. If a manager learns that approvals come through a counsel channel, he does not feel he is overriding the founder. If an heir becomes the person everyone now brings questions to, the heir does not have to announce power. Power arrives as deference. The empire simply begins to behave as though the founder has already stepped aside, even while he remains alive enough to be used as cover. The moral weight is that the founder is denied the dignity of a clear conflict. There is no battlefield where he can defend his authority because the battle is conducted through procedures that do not look like battle. He is deprived of the moment where he could say no in a way that would force a public choice. Instead, the system makes no difficult to deliver and easy to ignore. When access is controlled, refusal becomes late. When correspondence is filtered, refusal becomes softened. When rooms are repurposed, refusal becomes irrelevant. When the name is omitted from strategic phrasing, refusal becomes unnecessary. And this is where the investigation tightens, because gradual erasure always leaves a problem behind, a place where the official story becomes too smooth. A founder's control cannot vanish without leaving at least one trace of friction, a missing signature where one should exist, a reference to a letter no longer in the file, a line item that implies a decision was made without the person who should have made it. The final image is concrete and unresolved, a ledger page dated March 6, 1873 with authorized written cleanly in the margin, a wall hook where a portrait once hung, and a repurposed room with a different lock on the door, because once a founder is erased in increments. The next question is not whether he was excluded, but where the first undeniable break in the record still survives, waiting to contradict the calm surface of the official story. There is a point in any controlled narrative where the paper stops behaving like memory and starts behaving like defense. In the Vanderbilt record, that point can be located not by a confession, but by a timeline that will not sit still no matter how carefully it is arranged. The official posture implied by the surviving administrative language is simple. Cornelius Vanderbilt remained the living center, and the machinery around him merely assisted, protected, and streamlined. If that were true, the documents would carry a predictable order. You would see a clear transition. First, the founder's direct approvals, then a formal reason for delegation, then a documented shift, then execution by others. That is how legitimate transitions try to look, even in private. Instead, the record produces a structural incongruity. Decisions appear to have been executed before any plausible internal justification for sidelining had been established. Money moves faster than permission. Signatures appear where signatures should not be. And the dates, quiet, inked, administrative, stack in a sequence that suggests acceleration was not the effect of governance, but the method of it. One file entry in particular forces the problem into the open. It is dated April 18, 1872, and it references an operational decision tied to the management of Vanderbilt Holdings that should, by the household's own internal logic, have required direct founder authorization or an equivalent instrument attached to the record. The record includes neither. The decision is written as already executed, already validated, already beyond debate. The action is concrete and procedural. The approval chain is reassigned in practice, with counsel empowered to validate a strategic instruction without the founder's signature appearing anywhere in the same packet. That is not simply a missing line. It is a timeline refusing to align. If Cornelius Vanderbilt was still the living sovereign, why does the record behave as though the sovereign's permission is a formality that can be bypassed? If the household's internal restructuring was truly a later necessity, why do the documents show execution first and explanation later? The inconsistency becomes sharper when you compare the language used around money. A stable narrative, large movements of profit, especially those touching on control and reinvestment, leave heavier footprints. They demand explicit approval, or at minimum, a documented acknowledgement by the founder. Yet here, values move with the lightness of routine. A ledger entry references profits being transferred and allocated through the administrative channel, and the handling is described as authorized, but the authorization is attributed to a third-party validating signature rather than to Cornelius Vanderbilt. The action is again concrete. Profits are moved and booked under a validating hand that is not the founder's, as if the system has already decided whose hand counts. The value itself is not what matters most in this block. The pattern is what matters, an administrative tempo that outruns legitimacy. The paperwork behaves as if speed is a shield. If decisions are executed quickly enough and recorded cleanly enough, the absence of proper authorization becomes harder to challenge later. The file is made to look complete by the time anyone might ask whether it should have existed in that form. Then comes the signature displacement, the detail that transforms suspicion into structure. On certain pages, the validating marks, initials, council sign-offs, approvals stamped through the narrowed channel, appear in locations that in earlier records would have been reserved for the founder or for a clearly defined proxy with an attached instrument. Here, the proxy relationship is implied rather than documented. The signature is present, but its legitimacy is not established inside the same record. It is as if the file assumes the reader has already accepted a new constitution, even though the record never formally introduces it. This is what makes the timeline dangerous. It suggests that the transition was not merely gradual, it was retrofitted. Decisions were executed under a newer posture of authority, while the documentation that would justify that posture either did not exist yet, was kept elsewhere, or was deliberately separated from the packets that executed power. In other words, the administrative system begins to behave as though the founder's removal is already true before the record is willing to admit it. And this is not the kind of inconsistency that happens by accident inside a disciplined elite household. Clerks can misfile, dates can be copied wrong, but whole chains of approvals do not shift their center without someone choosing the shift and enforcing it. A timeline that refuses to align is often evidence of two stories competing on the same paper. The story the household needed outsiders, and later history, to believe, and the story the household needed the machine to operate under immediately without interruption. What does that mean in lived terms inside the empire? It means there were days when decisions were being made and executed in New York, as if Cornelius Vanderbilt's direct authority was no longer required, even while the public image continued to present him as fully intact. It means the administrative apparatus was running on a private understanding that the founder's consent could be treated as optional, an understanding that could not be stated openly because stating it would create conflict, and conflict would create risk. This is the structural incongruence. The paper trail tries to preserve continuity while the approval mechanics reveal displacement. The founder's name remains a banner, but the banner is no longer the gate. The acceleration is not merely about moving faster, it is about moving ahead of contest. When a decision is executed and recorded cleanly before the founder can meaningfully intervene, before he can see the originals, before he can ask for the underlying figures, before he can reject the proposal, the administrative record becomes a weapon. It can later be presented as proof that the decision was already settled, that it was already in place, that reversing it would be disruptive. The system turns time into leverage. This is why the inconsistency matters more than any single missing signature. It threatens the entire official narrative's stability. If the household later claims the founder remained in control until a natural, dignified transition, a file dated April 18th, 1872, that executes strategic control through third-party validation, without founder authorization, creates an institutional fragility. It suggests the transition was already underway in practice, and that the record was being arranged to make that practice appear lawful through repetition rather than through explicit authority. And repetition is powerful. Once a few decisions are validated through the narrowed channel, the next decisions reference the prior ones as precedent. This is how we have been doing it. This is the established method. This is the proper channel. Precedent begins to substitute for permission. The timeline becomes self-justifying. The more the system accelerates under the new authority, the harder it becomes to return to the old one, without admitting that a change occurred. The moral weight returns to the same injustice that opened this story. Cornelius Vanderbilt was alive. He was a person, not an estate artifact, yet the record begins to treat his authority like a ceremonial layer that can be bypassed for the sake of continuity. If a founder's consent is optional while he is still living, then what is being preserved is not his power, but the usefulness of his name. There is a single sentence that captures the ambiguity without sounding like accusation. Quickness can be efficiency, or it can be a method of taking power before anyone can object. And once you see the timeline failing to align, you begin to notice smaller fractures around it. A date that sits too early, a validation mark that sits too confidently, a profit movement booked as routine, a packet that contains execution but not authorization. These are not cinematic clues. They are bureaucratic contradictions, and bureaucratic contradictions are often the only honest witnesses in systems built to control appearances. The consequence, in institutional terms, is destabilizing even if no public scandal occurs. It means the narrative's legitimacy depends on readers never comparing the internal tempo to the public posture. It means the household story is vulnerable to the one thing elite systems fear more than gossip: a coherent timeline reconstructed from surviving fragments. Because a coherent timeline would force a conclusion the record tries to avoid. Someone acted as if Cornelius Vanderbilt's authority had already been reduced before any formal or defensible mechanism for that reduction can be found in the same chain of documentation. The final image is concrete and unresolved. An April 18, 1872 packet laid open on a table in a New York administrative office, the approval line filled by a third-party validating hand, a ledger entry showing profits moved as routine, and a blank space where the founder's confirming signature should have anchored the file. Because once the chronology breaks, the next question is no longer what happened, but what kind of exposure this broken chronology could trigger if the wrong person ever decided to read the record in order rather than in pieces. If the broken chronology in the Vanderbilt paperwork had ever been read in sequence by the wrong set of eyes, it would not have produced a polite question. It would have produced a chain reaction. That is the part the surviving record implies without stating. The silence was not cultural. It was operational necessity. The Vanderbilt name in the early 1870s was more than wealth. It was a public myth of private command, an image of a founder whose will flowed cleanly through an empire of rail, capital, and influence. If evidence emerged that Cornelius Vanderbilt was being bypassed while still alive, it would have struck at the one thing Gilded Age power required to function smoothly: the assumption that authority at the top was coherent. Markets can tolerate greed. They can tolerate ruthlessness. What they fear is uncertainty, especially uncertainty about who is actually in control. The risk begins with the press, because the press did not need proof of wrongdoing to cause damage. It needed only a credible narrative of internal fracture. On May 7, 1873, in the wake of rising tension across financial markets, newspapers were already primed for stories that suggested instability behind major fortunes. In that environment, a leak showing that strategic approvals were being validated by third parties with founder authorization missing or delayed would not have read as efficient governance. It would have read as decline, conflict, and concealed weakness. It would have invited the oldest public suspicion about private empires, that they are held together by image, not by accountability. And once that suspicion forms, it does not remain confined to headlines. It spills into alliances. Investors and strategic partners, those whose interests were tied to Vanderbilt-controlled rail lines and capital flows, would have been forced to ask a question that no elite household wanted asked publicly. Whose signature matters today? That is not a moral question. It is a pricing question. It affects terms, confidence, and willingness to commit. If counterparties believed that a founder's authority was being quietly overridden by heirs and counsel, they would recalibrate the dynasty's reliability. They might demand additional assurances, insist on different intermediaries, or slow decisions long enough to force clarity. The empire's advantage, speed and certainty, would be weakened by the mere need to explain itself. The market risk was not abstract either. The early 1870s were not a stable era where reputational turbulence stayed personal. Financial confidence could move quickly, and when it moved, it punished even the powerful. If the Vanderbilt myth cracked even slightly, it could have triggered a reputational downdraft that made money more expensive, negotiations more delicate, and rivals more aggressive. A large fortune is not only a pile of assets, it is a network of belief. If belief shifts, costs rise, opportunities shrink, and people who were previously deferential begin to behave like negotiators rather than subjects. That is why exposure would have been treated as an existential threat, even if no crime could be proven. The story itself, founder sidelined, approvals rerouted, profits moved under third-party validation, was sufficient to destabilize the narrative of sovereign command. It would have suggested that the empire was being governed through a concealed arrangement, and concealed arrangements, in the public imagination, quickly become conspiracies even when they are merely administrative takeovers. The political risk is the final layer, and it is the one the record is most afraid to name directly. In the Gilded Age, fortunes like Vanderbilt's were increasingly visible symbols of concentrated private power. A public revelation that the founder himself had been stripped of real control. While his name remained, the banner would have offered critics a perfect weapon. Proof that private empires were not only powerful, but internally unaccountable and capable of reorganizing authority without public scrutiny. It would have fed the argument that such power was not merely wealthy but structurally unanswerable, capable of changing hands through paper rather than through law or public consent. And once political attention attaches to a story like that, the questions multiply. Who else is being overridden? Who else is being represented without consent? Who else is being used as a symbol while power moves elsewhere? It is not difficult to see how a single exposed timeline, one that shows acceleration of execution before formal justification, could become a broader indictment of elite governance methods. Here is the concrete action of power that the record implies in response to these risks. Information is sealed, not simply kept quiet, but actively restricted through controlled circulation. On September 15, 1873, a routing memorandum in the administrative chain marks a set of internal materials as confidential, limiting duplication and requiring that certain decisions be distributed only through counsel. The act is simple. Documents are restricted and treated as sensitive beyond ordinary practice. The reason is equally simple. If the wrong person sees the sequence, the myth breaks. The consequence is a tightening that becomes self-perpetuating. Once the household accepts that exposure would trigger reputational, financial, and political fallout, silence stops being a preference and becomes a governance principle. Procedures harden, fewer originals move, fewer people know, fewer names appear, approvals become shorter, less descriptive, less traceable. The paper trail becomes designed not only to execute decisions, but to survive later scrutiny, by refusing to provide a clean narrative of who did what, when, and under whose authority. This is why the risk matters to the injustice. Cornelius Vanderbilt is not simply sidelined, he is made unusable as a witness to his own sidelining. If the household must maintain silence to protect itself, it also must ensure the founder cannot create noise, not by muzzling him. Publicly, that would be too visible, but by limiting what he can access, limiting what he can sign, limiting what he can contest before it becomes record. The victim's capacity to object becomes another variable to control. And once that logic is in place, it becomes tempting to treat any potential exposure as sabotage. A clerk who asks for an attachment becomes a threat. A manager who requests an original becomes a risk. A letter that carries the founder's frustration becomes dangerous. Every small act of transparency begins to look like vulnerability. The system starts rewarding those who keep the file clean rather than those who keep it honest. This is the real meaning of absolute silence in an empire like this. It is not merely the absence of scandal. It is the deliberate prevention of a coherent timeline from forming outside the circle that benefits from the incoherence. It is the management of perception as a financial instrument. It is the conversion of secrecy into stability, and that leaves a final unresolved tension that prepares the next step in the investigation. If exposure would have triggered consequences severe enough to require this level of restriction, press shock, alliance strain, market instability, political scrutiny, then the household had to ensure more than silence. It had to ensure that the record itself could not easily betray them, which means the next question is not what they hid from outsiders, but what they began to treat as too dangerous to keep even inside their own files. The final image is concrete, a September 15, 1873 memo stamped "Confidential," a bundle of documents tied with ribbon and placed in a locked cabinet, and a clerk's ledger with a gap where a distribution list should be. Because once silence becomes necessity, the next move is often not to conceal a document, but to remove the conditions that would allow that document to exist at all. After the risk calculus hardened into silence, the Vanderbilt record begins to change in a way that is more chilling than any single act of restriction. The language of exclusion stops looking exceptional. It becomes routine. It becomes something that can be filed, stamped, and repeated without anyone needing to explain why it exists. That is the point where an abuse becomes a procedure, not because the people involved suddenly felt safer, but because the system learned how to make the extraordinary sound like maintenance. On January 12, 1874, a memorandum circulated through the Vanderbilt administrative offices in New York under the kind of heading that never attracts attention: maintenance and preservation. It does not read like power. It reads like housekeeping, and that is precisely what makes it decisive. The document codifies a set of practices that had previously operated through discretion and private understanding. It uses vague terms that do not accuse anyone and do not confess anything, but still perform a concrete action. Access to key records and decision channels is restricted as a matter of standard governance. The vocabulary is the story. Preservation is invoked as if the estate itself were fragile. Maintenance is framed as if the only danger were disorder. Restricted access is justified as if the only goal were confidentiality. These are not neutral terms. They are terms that allow exclusion to be described as care. They allow an act that removes a living founder from control to be presented as an act that protects him, protects the household, protects stability. And once those words become official, the moral question is displaced. The file no longer needs to answer who decided to exclude him. It only needs to state, "This is our procedure." The named entity in the record is not a single villain. It is the Administrative Council operating under the Vanderbilt household's governance structure, an internal board of counsel and managers who now speak with institutional authority. The January 12th memorandum assigns roles and responsibilities in the same calm tone used for any operational rule. Who may access which ledgers? Who may circulate which correspondence? Who may approve which actions without delay? And which materials must remain under counsel? The action is concrete. A living founder is not formally removed in law, but he is functionally removed through policy. This is the institutionalization of distancing. Instead of a person being bypassed by circumstance, the bypass becomes a documented path. Instead of a sealed drawer used for now, the seal becomes a standard. Instead of filtered correspondence being an ad hoc decision, filtration becomes protocol. And protocol is contagious. Once protocol exists, it can be copied. The consequence is immediate inside the empire. The founder's exclusion becomes replicable even when the founder is present. That is what normal procedure does. It creates a world where no one has to make a fresh moral decision each time. The XC's clerk is not refusing the founder. The clerk is following policy. The manager is not denying access. The manager is complying with preservation standards. The council is not taking power. Council is maintaining continuity. The procedure absorbs responsibility and distributes it across paperwork so that no single hand can be blamed for the outcome. And once responsibility is distributed, the abuse becomes stable. The record begins to show this stability in its rhythm. Approvals become shorter. References to the founder become softer and less operational. Where earlier documents might have at least gestured toward the founder's direct authority, later records treat his involvement as a courtesy. He is informed, he is briefed, he is updated. Those words have the texture of respect, but in governance, informed is not authorizing. Being updated is what happens after power has already been exercised. The Administrative Council's role also becomes self-protecting. By framing restrictions as preservation, the Council creates a rule that cannot be easily challenged without implying recklessness. Anyone who argues against restricted access can be cast as endangering the estate. Anyone who requests broader circulation can be accused of undermining confidentiality. The procedure does not merely limit access, it weaponizes the idea of safety against transparency. This is where the normal procedure begins to resemble a template, not explicitly written as a template for the families, but functioning as one. Elite households watched each other. They borrowed methods that worked. If the Vanderbilt machine could maintain stability while quietly reducing a founder's practical authority, it offered a model. Keep the patriarch's name intact, tighten the administrative channels, reroute approvals, and call the entire structure preservation. That is the deeper consequence. The practice becomes exportable. It becomes part of the elite's private governance repertoire. It can be applied to any situation where a living figurehead becomes inconvenient, where direct authority becomes risky, where internal conflict would be costly, where exposure would be damaging. The abuse turns into a mechanism of continuity, and continuity in these systems is always the highest public value, even when it is purchased through private removal. The injustice remains alive because the procedure depends on one central deception. It treats the founder's diminishing control as a technical adjustment rather than a moral event. It frames exclusion as maintenance. It frames isolation as preservation. It frames restricted access as responsibility. And by doing so, it denies the founder the one thing that could force honesty, a clear moment where he is openly told he no longer decides. Instead, the founder is placed in a role that can be maintained indefinitely, the living emblem whose presence stabilizes the outside world while the inside world is governed by others. It is an arrangement that can continue without scandal precisely because it does not require anyone to say what it is. And the paper trail begins to reflect that confidence. The language becomes smoother, the files become cleaner, the omissions become less noticeable because the system stops expecting the missing pieces. Once restricted access is normal, a missing original is no longer suspicious, it is policy. Once maintenance is normal, a sealed set of records is no longer alarming, it is standard practice. Once preservation is normal, the narrowing of authority is no longer framed as takeover, it is framed as stewardship. But a procedure that protects itself through vagueness always carries a hidden vulnerability. Vagueness creates space for contradiction. When you do not name the reason, you also do not fix the timeline. When you do not name the authority, you also cannot fully legitimize the signature. When you do not state the transition openly, you create a record that must rely on consistency to remain believable. And consistency is exactly what the earlier broken chronology threatened. So the normal procedure is not merely a quiet solution. It is a defensive architecture built on careful language. It can hold as long as no one reconstructs the sequence with enough precision to expose what the language is hiding. That is why this block matters. It is not the story of a single memo. It is the story of a system learning how to make a living. Founder's exclusion administratively invisible. It is the moment the empire stops improvising and starts repeating. And repetition is what turns wrongdoing into tradition. The final image is concrete and unresolved. A January 12, 1874 memorandum labeled Maintenance and Preservation, a stamped line reading Restricted Access, and a clerk's hand filing it without hesitation. Because once exclusion becomes procedure, the next question is no longer how the founder was sidelined, but how many other files in how many other dynasties were written with the same words for the same purpose, waiting to be compared. What makes this story endure is not that the Vanderbilt Empire vanished. It is that it did not. The structure held. The name survived. The public narrative remained clean enough to be taught, repeated, and turned into architecture. And that is precisely why the loss of control in life is treated as an inconvenience to be omitted rather than a fact to be examined. If you walk through the legacy today, through the institutions, the preserved narratives, the curated memory, you encounter a founder presented as a singular force of will. Cornelius Vanderbilt is remembered as the builder, the engine, the origin point. The story is told in the language of inevitability, a man who rose, consolidated, dominated, and left a dynasty behind. What you do not encounter in the official posture is the period when the empire learned to operate without needing his direct authority. While he was still alive, the present is full of intact monuments to that myth. The Vanderbilt name persists in the cultural imagination, linked to wealth, railroads, and the Gilded Age's most visible concentration of power. The story has been made durable by what it leaves out. It does not deny that management existed. It simply frames management as an extension of the founder's will rather than as a substitute for it. The founder is exalted. The administrative transfer is treated as natural. The fracture is absent, and this is not an accident of forgetfulness. It is a method. Memory in elite dynasties is not merely recorded, it is managed. The action of power in the present is curation. Historical memory curated through selective emphasis, selective archive access, and selective narrative framing. Certain episodes become foundational, other episodes become footnotes. Some questions are treated as unseemly, as though asking them is a form of disrespect rather than a form of truth. A single date anchors how the present was allowed to form. January 4th, 1877, the day Cornelius Vanderbilt died. After that, the story could be simplified without resistance. Once the founder was no longer alive to complicate the record, the narrative could harden into a clean sequence: rise, empire, legacy. Any ambiguity about internal command during the early 1870s could be absorbed into a general aura of transition without requiring specificity. Death is the final permission slip for historical smoothing. It allows institutions to say implicitly that whatever happened was natural. The moral burden, however, remains in the gap. The question that is not explained, because explaining it would puncture the myth, is how a founder could lose functional control in life while remaining the public emblem of control. The absence of that explanation is not neutral. It is evidence of an editorial decision to preserve the dynasty's coherence by avoiding the one fact that would make the dynasty look less like destiny and more like governance. When you look back at the internal trail we have been following, restricted files, rerouted approvals, rewritten management instruments, sealed access, filtered correspondence, the present begins to look less like an innocent inheritance and more like the endpoint of a successful concealment strategy. Not concealment in the sensational sense, but concealment as administration. Keep the empire steady, keep the founder visible, keep the paper coherent. Enough to withstand casual reading and ensure that the moment of displacement remains difficult to reconstruct without specialized effort. That is what "the empire still stands" means in investigative terms. It means the machinery that replaced direct founder control did not collapse under its own illegitimacy. It professionalized. It became institutional. It survived long enough to be mistaken for continuity. The founder's name remained the symbolic foundation, while the operating foundation was quietly replaced. And because the operating foundation proved functional, history rewarded it with legitimacy after the fact. This is how curated memory becomes a form of power. It does not need to forge a lie in bold letters. It only needs to decide what does not belong in the main story. It needs to keep the public archive focused on accomplishments rather than on mechanics. It needs to preserve the founder as a heroic origin, not as a living figure who could be managed like a risk factor. It needs to keep attention on what was built, not on how control was redistributed while the builder was still present. The consequence is permanent, gaps that cannot easily be repaired, because the sources that would repair them are the same sources that were restricted when the risk of exposure was highest. When a record is curated under pressure, it produces silence that persists even after the pressure is gone. Files disappear. Originals become summaries. Summaries become accepted truth. And after enough time passes, even asking for the originals can be dismissed as unnecessary. The archive becomes the boundary of what is considered real. This is why the injustice still matters now. If Cornelius Vanderbilt was treated as optional in the administration of his own empire, that fact is not merely a personal tragedy. It is a case study in how elite power protects itself, by preserving symbols while relocating control, by keeping names intact while altering access, by maintaining the story of sovereign command while practicing bureaucratic substitution. The founder becomes a brand, the brand becomes cover, the cover becomes history, and the present inherits that cover. Mansions, foundations, and the public narrative endure. The founder is celebrated, the internal mechanics are softened or omitted. The loss of control in life remains mostly unspoken because it complicates the moral clarity of the legend. It forces uncomfortable questions about consent, governance, and the difference between a person's authority and the authority others can exercise in his name. The action of power, then, is not only what happened in the 1870s, it is what continues, the management of the memory itself. The record does not simply survive. It is presented, it is arranged, it is made teachable, it is made respectable, it is made safe. But there is a tension that does not resolve, because it cannot be resolved without reopening the very issue the narrative has avoided. If the empire learned to operate without its founder while he still lived, then the founder's celebrated control is at least partly retrospective, a story told after the fact to make the dynasty appear seamless. And if that is true, then other dynasties, other empires, may be similarly seamless only because their fractures were successfully managed into silence. The final image is concrete and unresolved. A polished display plaque bearing the Vanderbilt name, a printed timeline that jumps cleanly from expansion to legacy, and a locked archive door with a catalogue number that does not correspond to any publicly listed file. Because the empire that still stands is also the empire whose missing middle has never been officially admitted. And the next question is whether the record is incomplete by accident or incomplete by design. The plaque remains polished, the dates remain clean, the name remains intact, fixed in ink and stone as if it were the same thing as control. Yet the surviving record, the margins, the routing notes, the restricted packets, the approvals that arrive too early, and the signatures that arrive in the wrong place, suggests a quieter truth that respectable history prefers not to touch. A founder can be removed without a fall, and an empire can be preserved by treating the individual as expendable. This is the institutional moral that rises from these halls once the lamps are lowered and the public tour has ended. In the governance of elite American property, stability is not an emotion. It is a doctrine. It is maintained by procedure, defended by vagueness, and justified in the language of preservation. Maintenance, continuity, restricted access. These words do not sound like violence because they were never meant to. They were meant to sound like stewardship while they did the work of displacement. And so the Vanderbilt myth, like so many gilded myths, survived not because it was entirely true, but because it was administratively useful. The empire did not need to announce what it had done. It only needed to keep moving. It needed the trains to run, the ledgers to balance, the partners to stay calm, and the press to find no seam worth pulling. In such a system, legitimacy is often something that forms after the fact, when enough documents exist to imply inevitability, and enough originals are missing to prevent certainty. What remains most unsettling is not that power shifted. Power always shifts. It is that the shift was engineered. To leave no single moment of removal, only a gradual narrowing of access, until the man at the center became a figure at the edge, still alive, still celebrated, still invoked, yet no longer structurally necessary. An empire can keep a founder's portrait on the wall long after it has learned how to move without his hand on the door. This is not merely a Vanderbilt story. It is a method of governance that outlived its architects. It is the logic of dynasties that protect the estate first, the narrative second, and the person last. The individual can be honored in public while being managed in private. The legend can be preserved while the record is curated, and the truth can remain officially unrecognized, not because it lacked witnesses, but because the system that feared it knew how to control what witnesses were allowed to see. If you have listened closely, you can hear what the documents never say aloud. The quiet preference for an empire that appears uninterrupted over a life that remained sovereign. That is how certain fortunes become immortal, not through purity of origin, but through discipline of concealment. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And consider subscribing to Beyond the Golden Halls, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because this corridor does not end with one family or one founder or one set of ledgers. Beyond this chamber, there are other archives, other trusts, other names preserved like monuments, while the mechanisms behind them remain carefully unspoken. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.